Okay, for the last few lectures, we've been talking about psychoanalytic anthropology, and we have discussed some of the problems with the approach, including the fact that you couldn't really verify the theories, that they were vulnerable to fads, and that they were vulnerable to constructing elaborate theories without any real proof that they were true. Now, this wasn't just a problem in psychoanalytic anthropology, it was actually a common problem through a lot of anthropology in the 19th century. You know, anthropology as a discipline really got started in the middle of the 19th century with people like Edward Burnett Tylor, Lewis Henry Morgan, James George Frazer, and so on. Now, as we've mentioned, this was during an age of colonization and exploration at a time when lots of data was coming in from missionaries and conquerors about distant people all around the world, and people, especially in England and parts of the United States, were trying to make sense of it all. Now, there was a tendency in the larger society outside of anthropology to regard all these reports they were getting as evidence that people out in the rest of the world were insane or that they were perverse. Early anthropology tried to counteract that by showing all this stuff as part of a system. These unfamiliar people who Western Europe was just learning about from all these travelers and missionaries, they weren't beyond understanding. Rather, they could be understood in the context of the development of culture. In a sense, what anthropology was trying to provide was a scientific approach to cultural diversity, something that would unify all the different kinds of culture that people were being introduced to into a common explanatory system. Now, the scientific model of the time, of course, was evolution. Evolution seems pretty commonplace to us now, but just think of the impact that it had when it first came out. It was a stunning, truly revolutionary idea. Charles Darwin made it possible to understand the myriad permutations of biology, all the bizarre and different species that you found in the world, and it linked them all together as types of evolutionary adaptation. There was a simple process of evolution by natural selection that explained all of the diversity that you found across the animal world. Now, allied to this was an idea of evolution as a rise from primitive to advanced forms. That was the way people tended to think of evolution. It's the way a lot of people still think of evolution. Now, this isn't part of Darwin's theory, but it was a basic way that scientists at the time thought about culture and history. There was this idea that things evolved from primitive, simpler, less developed forms to better and more advanced ones. So early anthropologists, when they were looking for a scientific model to explain all the cultural diversity they were looking at, used this one. They said essentially that the various customs and tribal lifeways that people were encountering could be understood as different phases in the evolution of culture. It wasn't that these strange people were crazy or sick or perverse or something. They were just less evolutionarily developed. They were further back in the evolutionary process than the people in Western Europe were. We're all on a common ladder, they're just a little bit further back. Now, they used a model that is sometimes referred to as unilineal evolution. Unilineal meaning one line, right? One path, one set of stages that all cultures went through in their development. You started out in caves, then you moved to huts, then you moved to stick houses, then to stone houses, and then brick houses, and eventually to advanced modern architecture. You started out with hunting and gathering, then you moved to horticulture, then to agriculture, then to industrial production, and then to high-tech production. Now, in this model, and I want to stress that it's just a model, in this model, every culture is moving in the same direction through the same set of stages. The idea, though, is that they don't all move at the same pace. Some of them are more advanced than others. And some can even get stuck. They can get stuck in a particular stage of human development and never advance any further on their own. Okay, that was the model they were using, unilineal evolution. Now, why did they use that model? Well, the great thing about unilineal evolution, if it were true, is that it would let you use cultural diversity as a guide to history. Right? Suppose, for example, that you're a 19th century Englishman and you feel like you are just about the most advanced society in the world, but you would like to know more about your history. What was England like a few thousand years ago when people were living in stone huts? That's actually a very hard question to answer because, of course, we don't have any written records from that period, and there's relatively little archaeological evidence. There's some, but not a lot. So you are limited in how much you can find out about your past. But if you accept unilineal evolution, then there is in fact a solution. All you have to do is travel around the world until you find a primitive-looking culture where they still live in the kind of stone huts that your ancestors lived in back then. That means that they are stuck on the same point of the evolutionary ladder as your ancestors were a few thousand years ago. So if you look at their culture, you can get a sense of what your ancestors' culture was like at that time. Ethnography, in other words, a study of cultural diversity around the world, becomes a kind of history. And as a result, a lot of historians and archaeologists really loved the idea of unilineal evolution. So it was well meant, and it was a constructive approach, but however well meant it was, it had a major drawback that for all of its neatness and utility, it was very culturally biased. It assumes that you can rank all cultures in terms of how much they resemble the modern West, right? Our own culture is seen as the high point of human social and technological development. That is not an objective classification so much as a projection of Western stereotypes. We're great and everybody else is working their way up to be like us. And because of that, it forces you to shoehorn people into this unilineal scheme in ways that are often profoundly inaccurate. Because in fact, unilineal evolution isn't true. There is in fact no single path by which culture and technology evolve. There are lots of different possibilities. You can make hundreds of different kinds of houses out of stone or sticks or mud or sod or whatever it is. And the fact is that all of them work pretty well. And there are many things that don't evolve at all. There are different ways of doing them, all of which are equally viable. There are dozens of different ways of reckoning kinship terminology, for example. All of them work just fine. And none of the ones that are around nowadays seems to be any more original or any more advanced than any other. In fact, unilineal evolution forces you to put people into a framework that really isn't there. Now, the problems with this approach in anthropology were exposed most clearly around the turn of the century by an anthropologist named Franz Boas, who has often been called the father of American anthropology. Boas, who worked at Columbia University, said that these grand schemes can't hold. The more you look at these big evolutionary models, the more you look at any enormously complex scheme that tries to pigeonhole everybody into one mechanism, the more you do that, the closer you look at them, the more they fall apart. And in fact, Boas suggested that there really isn't a scheme like that. You're better off, instead of trying to construct these big evolutionary models, focus instead on the specific details of particular cultures. Try to get the details of cultures right. Later on, you can worry about putting them all into some sort of a big picture. Instead of starting with a big scheme, start with the little stuff, the minutiae. Put those together and see if you can find anything in them that assembles into a pattern. In other words, it was what scientists would call an inductive rather than a deductive way of understanding culture. So what Boas did, and I want to stress that this was an important corrective to the sort of baseless theorizing that categorized a lot of anthropology in the 19th century. What Boas and his followers did was to compile lists of traits for different cultures, to classify lots and lots and lots of specific details about their social organization, their technology, their religion, their ritual, many, many other things. They tried to, as much as possible, to look at the details very well in every culture. It was an approach that came to be known in anthropology as historical particularism. It looked at particular cultures in terms of their own history, not in some generally large model. Now, I want to say that this was an important correction in anthropology, and it gained a lot of prominence in anthropology in the first decades of the 20th century. But it did lead to one big problem. Boas was so focused on seeing the individual bits of culture correctly that he was unable to see culture as more than the sum of its parts. He was unable to say anything about culture as a system. Boas and his followers were so shy of getting the theory wrong that they didn't wind up looking at culture as a system at all. It was just a big catalog of traits. Anthropology needed an approach which would provide more integration, which would explain how the parts of culture came together and reflected one another. But they needed something that was not going to fall back on the old evolutionary schemes, something that would respect the real diversity and individuality of every culture. So that's where they were at the start of the 20th century. And this is where we come back to psychology. Because actually, that same period, the field of psychology had been undergoing a similar sort of crisis, right? Because in a lot of ways, describing a personality presents some of the same problems as describing a culture. People are complex creations. They have lots and lots of different traits and facets. How do you make sense of all those? Under the leadership of a psychologist named Wundt, turn-of-the-century psychology had gone in much the same direction as Boas, focusing on the traits and behaviors of individuals rather than the patterns that they made. And around 1912, several German psychoanalysts put forth a proposition that this really was inadequate. They said that psychology was not just a collection of traits, but it was a totality. It was a whole. It was a pattern. What is referred to in German as a Gestalt. Human beings, they said, try to make meaning out of the world. They try and fit everything into a coherent system. Thus, if you look at an individual personality, the individual traits that are part of it have to be understood not just as themselves, but also elements of this Gestalt. You know, you can observe this in people around you. Think of somebody who's aggressive, right? He or she will probably be aggressive in many contexts. In the classroom, in the baseball field, in family relationships, in sexual relationships. Aggressiveness is going to be something that runs through the person's entire personality. And any individual thing that the person does is only going to make sense in this context, right? What would be normal behavior for, say, Nicolas Cage would not be normal behavior for, say, Emma Thompson. The overall patterns that they have inform the normality of any individual thing they do. So if you want to understand personality, you have to see individual personality as an integrated system, as a whole, as a Gestalt. Now, Gestalt psychology was very influential in anthropology because it pointed out the thing that had been missing in Boas, in historical particularism, this idea that individual traits are more than themselves. Some anthropologists argued that this might work for culture too. That you had to look at culture as something like a personality, a system in which each individual trait, each individual item is shaped to make sense in the context of all the others in a total pattern.